we have determined that Gustave Courbet was an active communard in his later years who was found guilty of destroying the majestic Vendôme column and was heavily fined for this crime, which explains his fleeing to Switzerland to escape the bailiff. We could therefore expect that he was a political painter, but maybe this deduction is slightly risky. Maybe the obvious needs to be verified and demands further investigation before such assumptions can be taken for granted.
Let's begin with the trilogy he painted right after the Revolution. For this, we should wonder about the role Gustave Courbet took during the French 1848 Revolution. I mentioned earlier on that Courbet attempted to become an elected member of the National Assembly in 1871. Indeed, we have the electoral speech he sent to the Rappel Journal, where he wrote, "In 1848, I opened a socialist club in opposition to the clubs of the Jacobins and the Montagnards. Yet we have no proof that Courbet participated in any clubs or societies at this time. Was he involved in politics for the length of time that he claimed to be? What was his involvement in the first great revolution of 1848? The first and bourgeois phase of the revolution in February 1848 marked the restoration of the Republic. It put an end to the monarchy of July and established its first government. The second phase of June 1848 was a radical revolution, but it failed. What, we might ask, was Courbet doing? We have a letter he wrote to his parents in March of that year. I give little time to politics, as is my habit. I find nothing more empty, nothing more futile than that." Commenting that when he hears shouting such as "Death to the Communists" or "Long live Blanqui," he believes that it's ridiculous and meaningless. To each his own. I am a painter and I make paintings. This quote clearly demonstrates that Courbet was self-conceptualizing as a painter, not a politician. He isn't a politically conscious painter at this point in time. Far from it, in fact. We are going to make excuses for him because prior to this, he wrote to his parents informing them that a new artistic school was being established and that he was going to be its representative. An increasing number of influential people had become interested in his artwork, and Courbet had become rather proud of this. It is true that, historically, republics weren't in favour of artistic practice, so we could grant him a few excuses for his disinterest. Our future communard was never an active supporter of the 1848 revolution, it transpires. So it is not accurate to make a claim that he had always participated in politics. Courbet did achieve some particular things. At the time, he was very close to Charles Baudelaire, and he made a drawing for the frontispiece of the Salut Public, a small journal that had only 2 printed editions. This image is from the second, a publication comprising merely 4 pages, since they were experiencing financial problems. Baudelaire asked Courbet to draw him something, and this is what Courbet came up with, modelled on Liberty Guiding the People by Eugène Delacroix. In his drawing, we can recognise Baudelaire, who must have been about 27 at the time. Baudelaire had spent months reading Joseph de Maistre and Marquis de Sade, and was quite right-wing. But then he would spend a month or so consuming cannabis and opium, and during this time, he would see himself as rather more left-wing. But in this instance, he is clearly left-wing since we find him on the barricades. How does Courbet represent him? Well, he is depicted with an artisan's cutlass, a worker's blouse, a top hat, and bourgeois clothing torn in such a way that he appears to be half dandy and half bohemian. Courbet doesn't choose one particular class. He certainly doesn't choose the class of which Baudelaire is a part of, either because he's protecting himself or simply because he didn't feel the need to make this distinction. He isn't yet socialised or politicised and hasn't become consciously left-wing. But all the same, as I was saying, he paints this image in 1849 and exhibits it in 1851, when he will be portrayed as a socialist painter. In June 1848, he isn't on the barricades and isn't a 48ard, a nickname for the revolutionaries. So, we might wonder, what happened to reshape his political image? Firstly, he is lucky enough to win a medal at the Salon of 1849. He presents after dinner at Ornans and wins a second-rank gold medal, which extraordinarily permits him to exhibit at the Salon without being judged by a panel, and thus avoiding its overly academic censorship.
En d'autres termes, il passe à travers la censure, il peut passer ce qu'il veut.
After winning 1,500 francs, Courbet paints 3 successive works. He returns to his village with his medal and is much celebrated by the villagers of Ornans. He had developed Charles Baudelaire's Parisian Bohemia of Champfleury and friends, thus enabling him to get down to creating his famous trilogy.
Cette fameuse trilogie qui est la période la plus productrice de Courbet de son vivant. Il va nous peindre
First, he paints a burial at Ornans.
Ensuite, il va nous peindre
Then,
de
Stonebreakers.
pierre et le retour de Flagey qu'on va étudier.
And, lastly, the peasants from Flagey, returning from the fair that we're about to look at.
C'est pas un grand
As with any good study, we will cut to the chase and first consider who is represented. So let's start with the burial, a short iconographic study followed by an investigation into composition. In 1849, Courbet isn't a great painter. He isn't Paul Chenevard, he isn't Jacques-Louis David, he isn't a great master with a huge workshop. His studio is located in his father's attic, which means that when he paints a burial, he has to wrap and unwrap the canvas as he goes. But let's cut to the chase. We are going to start identifying who these people are.
Alors, vous avez
Here you have the village priest.
du village. Ici, les 4
And 4 gravediggers with their heads turned, maybe due to the corpse's odour.
puanteurs du cadavre. Vous avez alors
The person on the left can be identified as a cobbler,
un propriétaire
a wealthy farmer,
entier, un
a musician, and landlord.
Globalement, ce
We have an assortment of peasants, artisanal workers, and local bourgeoisie.
petit artisanat et de bourgeoisie locale. Vous avez ensuite ici
This is a gravedigger that we know is Antoine-Joseph Cassard, the son of a poor cobbler and
les
farmer.
paysans pauvres. Vous avez ici les 5 pardon, pas les enfants de chœur, vous avez ici les 5 sacristains.
Here are 5 sextons, 2 choir boys, and 2 vergers.
On a pu être
Some viewers of the painting were initially surprised by the medieval garments, but the gowns were commonly found in the church's sacristy.
ici ensuite un groupe d'hommes qui correspond à un groupe
In the foreground, there is a group of middle-class men, comprising a justice of the peace, the mayor, a retired officer, the one who's crying and has been converted to a
un
pawnbroker,
ancien gendarme qui est devenu prêteur sur gage, vous avez
a
un
miller,
meunier, un avocat
lawyer, a wealthy bourgeois, who is probably Courbet's father,
ici. Et puis vous avez
and then 2 revolutionaries.
missionnaires. Je suis
I'm not sure that they would always have dressed like this, but they are former Republicans from the years 1792 and 1793, who wear the white gaiters and blue stockings from the Revolution years.
c'est-à-dire les guêtres blanches et les bas bleus. Vous avez un personnage qui nous échappe sur
The person on the far left can be identified as Courbet's grandfather, who'd passed away a few months prior to this event.
quelques mois auparavant. Et puis sur
On the
la
right, we can see a group of women, and we can recognize his mother, 3 sisters, and little cousin.
Alors je ne sais pas si vous réalisez,
The painting is rather chaotic, so much so that we might be tempted to suggest that it is rather badly constructed.
c'est mal fait. C'est mal
This is especially true if we apply the laws of perspective that were set out during the Renaissance. The perspective is badly rendered, as is the crowd.
foule et mal rendu. Mais
But a lot of work is necessary to achieve this level of deconstruction and imperfection, which we can detect in Courbet's composition.
travail, il est là. Sur son
In
travail,
his preparatory drawing of a burial, we can see that the members of the procession are all looking at the coffin, all except 2 positioned towards the coffin.
les femmes
The women are concentrated to the right of the crowd, and their crying faces are all turned towards the casket. Not all of the faces are distinguishable due to the fact that if one wanted to represent a crowd, according to perspective,
roulent en perspective, ils vont
its
être
people should be placed one behind the other rather than being piled up on top of each other. Yet, if we turn to look at a burial, we can see a stack of individuals, and it is possible to distinguish each face, which isn't the case in the drawing.
chaque visage se découpe avec
If we adhere to the laws of perspective, the piling up of figures might lead us to believe that the ground upon which they stand is sloped.
perspective que le terrain est en pente. Or, il n'est
Yet it isn't sloped, because in the preparatory drawing, the faces aren't stacked up.
pas empilés les uns sur
In
les autres.
fact, in this painting, Courbet uses an ancient technique for the depiction of multitude. Through the stacking of faces, perspective is rendered obsolete, and thus Courbet's work is marked by a form of simplistic archaism.
L'autre chose sur laquelle j'aimerais insister, c'est
The other thing on which I would like to insist is that the crucifix in the painting still belonged to the earthly realm, for it is placed below the line of the horizon. He had been sent back to where he came from, which is a very realistic approach if you recall our last conference. Let me add to this with a line from Jacques Prévert's 20th century poem, which plays on the Lord's Prayer. Our Father who art in heaven, stay there and we will stay on earth, which is sometimes so delightful. With this displacement of only a few centimetres, Courbet sends the crucifix back to its initial space, the sky, located far from Earth.
dernier petit
Finally, let's look at the colours.
noir.
You have one black mass on the right and a white mass on the left, punctuated with blue, white and red.
Blanc, rouge. Je suis
I suppose you can imagine what I'm alluding to.
Moi, je vais arriver. On va regarder maintenant
We are
le-
now going to turn to the second painting in the trilogy, The Peasants from Flagey, and study its distribution of light and composition.
C'est dommage qu'en
Returning from the fair,
définition, c'est une...
this painting was poorly received, and critics declared it to be ghastly.
Voilà ce qu'ils en font.
Were Courbet's figures just a group of robots walking about chaotically? But this isn't unintentional.
Ils sont pas idiots, les...
Caricaturists aren't stupid, and they often offer greater insight than the critics themselves.
Alors, qu'est-ce qui se passe
So we might ask, what is the critical context of Return from Flagey?
de bohémien depuis la
The great Renaissance theoretician, Leon Battista Alberti, explains that when we represent a group, we need to remain within a logic of corporeal coherence. There needs to be an interaction between the characters, and every individual part of the painting needs to be articulated by other parts. Alberti's is a discourse that continues to be discussed in our academies to this day, but in Courbet's painting, corporeal coherence is disarticulated and shattered out of joint. So we might ask, what happened? Firstly, painters. I'm sorry, but they are liars. Why?
Parce que je reviens toujours à la
And because I will keep returning to this point, painting is a flat and two-dimensional surface.
dimensionnelle. Qu'est-ce
What do we try to do when we make an illusionistic painting?
qu'il
We try to lead our audiences into believing that there are three dimensions.
dimension, c'est-à-dire
That is to say, that when we're faced with the space in which we are currently evolving, we will be made to believe that there is a foreground, an intermediary plane, and a background. This is achieved by toying with the optical properties of colour, since some colours optically project, while others regress. Changing the dilution of pigments can also change the optical effects, but most importantly, one uses perspectival lines. So, what is Courbet doing here?
les pigments ici
The pigments are green and dense,
sont denses. C'est exactement
yet they're identical to those we can see in the background.
derrière. En d'autres
In other words, by using the same pigment and the same dilution, he joins the background and the foreground together.
le premier plan, ce qui est
The
bien,
consequence of which is a flattening of his painting that leaves no space for the characters. Traditionally,
on
we
est
are always supposed to have coherent lighting in a painting. If you try to understand what's going on in the composition, it becomes clear that there isn't one coherent light source, but rather fragmented spots on the ground.
Je ne vois pas, alors, et que les rayons arrivent de l'arrière, de cette manière-là.
If we have a sunset and the rays of light come from behind, the shade in this area makes little sense, unless we suppose that the sun is situated behind him. But if this is the case, we might query why his profile is lit. The lighting is therefore completely incoherent, yet the creation of a fictitious three-dimensional space entirely depends on this coherence. A good composition presupposes a well-articulated figure. A figure is not simply the individual. It encompasses the whole canvas, as they need to be well assimilated. There needs to be a good composition, or good articulation of the figure, where all elements lock into place. However, such cohesion does not exist in Courbet's painting. Do you get the impression that characters know each other? It looks somewhat like children have made transfer drawings, simply randomly placing each figure next to another.
mis les unes à côté des autres. Ces figures
These figures aren't conscious of each other's presence. Both women, presumably coming back from the market, surely wouldn't be walking like robots without gossiping. They would probably be chatting, yet here they have no contact.
de l'autre.
The two men aren't talking either.
Il a l'air lui
He looks particularly dislocated,
articulé ou
or at least has a stiff neck.
doute. Ce
The
personnage
figure is also dislocated,
articulé. Quand vous
since when you place your left foot forward, your body veers to the right.
votre buste, pardon, le pied en avant à gauche, le buste part à droite. Or ici,
Yet here he puts his foot forward and his body appears to lean in the same direction.
il est désarticulé. Ensuite,
Again, if we look at these two women, it seems to be that the same face is reproduced twice, except one is much bigger than the other.
côté. C'est normal.
She might be slightly further away, but it seems rather exaggerated to reduce the size of her face to such an extent.
Elle n'est pas placée.
With this small face, the farmer should be 2, 3, 4 meters further away. Simply put, there is little to no spatial cohesion in this painting. Another small detail.
Regardez,
Observe this character, the closest one to us, who looks as if he has been stuck onto the scene.
il est le plus proche de nous. Son cochon
His pig is trying to escape and run up the path towards the cattle. He is moving away from his spectators.
Le problème,
The problem I have is with the lead.
la laisse est
The
plus
lead is shinier here and gives off the impression that the pig is closer to us, but in reality, it is not.
plus près de nous. Or, il descend. Si je n'avais
If
pas
we didn't have the herd of cattle, the pig would be closer to us than this character on the right.
de nous que le personnage.
There is a total lack of coherence. Simply, it doesn't work.
C'est pas parce
It isn't because Courbet doesn't know how to work, but rather is because Courbet overworked to achieve this incoherence. The interesting question is, why?
Alors,
I
je-
suggest we have a quick look at what the critics wrote about his trilogy. This trilogy, including the Stonebreakers, supposedly made Courbet a socialist painter. But if we read what the critics have to say, we don't get a sense of why. Admittedly, there are a few private communications that give us a socialist impression. His friend, Max Bucon, wrote a letter in which he described Courbet as the veritable child of that rugged country, like Fourier, Proudhon, and Victor Hugo. It's a code. All three are from Franche-Comté. They are all socialists, or at the very least left-wing.
donc,
So Bucon assimilates him to other Franc-Comtés without saying why.
pays rouge. C'est une
And this is a letter, not a public critique.
On a
Today we have 37 contemporary critiques of a burial, and out of 37, only 3 indirectly mention socialism. There is François Sabatier, a future friend of Courbet, who writes in his Salon Review that Monsieur Courbet has a place in the current French school, like a cannonball who has just lodged in the
vient se
wall.
loger dans le mur. Et il
While
parle-
discussing democratic and popular art.
D'accord, il parle pas
Admittedly, he isn't talking of socialist art, but presumably a cannonball that strikes a wall after the revolution of June 1848 is metaphorically socialist. Léon Noël speaks of the legitimate heir of the 1848 revolution and of plebeian art.
D'accord. Le troisième,
The third critic adds that a burial is supposedly a revolutionary idea. It can therefore be granted that all 3 consider him to be a socialist painter, but this is through glimpses in marginal records and without much explanation. So we might ask, what do the others say? Did they do their work properly?
ben, les
Well, the others are offended. They all say, my goodness, how hideous. And here it is, this hideousness, as declared by the marvellous Honoré Daumier, who is always here to summarise the situation. This Mr. Courbet makes his figures much too vulgar.
Et vous avez une
We have at hand some 40 critics, 3 or 4 positive, 15 offended, but most others silent.
offusquée. La majorité se tait d'ailleurs.
In fact, most remain silent whenever we speak of a big scandal, while those who speak simply say how hideous or isn't it repulsive.
On parle
Some speak of vile cartoons inspiring disgust and causing laughter. Others declare that he must have a love of the ugly spiffed up, while others respond with, oh, the ugly people, and what people, and when one is done up like this, we should at least have the right not to be painted. Other critics mention that Courbet is the ugly version of Antoine Watteau, embodying life-size ugliness, triviality, and hideousness. So if I summarise 45 pages of criticism, what you will hear is ugly, 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 awful, 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 how horrible, hide it. Is this a proper critique? I'm not so sure. So now it is our turn to do the work the critics haven't done. This will be the subject of our 3rd chapter, a special political study of the burial at Ornans.